So today we are going to be talking about natural light. What is it and how can we use it and implement it into our photos to create more interesting compositions or just better pictures overall? Today I'm mainly going to be talking about natural light from my perspective, how I view it and how I interpret it and how I like to use it in my photographs. This is not going to be the most clinical or technical tutorial. This is just basically from my viewpoint. So hopefully some of these things help you guys out. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about what is natural light. Well, natural light just refers to the sun basically. So any photos you are taking outside or with use of the sun is going to have natural lighting. No implementation of your own lighting, no flash lighting, no strobes, no things like that to create your photos more interesting. Basically, it's just playing with the environment or just using your resources or what you have to create a better photograph or well-lit photograph. And I could talk about lighting for ages because lighting is such an important part of photography, but we'll kind of try and keep it into a basic sense for now. There are three main components of natural light, and that is going to be front lit situations, backlit situations, and kind of side lit situations. Those are kind of the three basics. Everything kind of falls in between those things, and you can use them to create more interesting photos or more stylistic photos depending on how you view the world. So natural light is something I enjoy very much. Generally, I don't like to bring a lot of lights with me or anything like that. I like to be in the moment and use the situation or the scene as it is, as I see it, and how it's made in originally to my advantage and kind of play with those things. So a lot of these things you are going to be seeing are more environmental portraits and things of the like. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my iPad up right now and I'll show you guys the first situation. This is a front lit scenario. So we'll go ahead and start with this first photo right here. This is a portrait I took of two of my friends when we went to the Grand Canyon about last March or so. And you could tell pretty easily that this is a front lit situation, meaning that I'm in between the subject and the light, aka the sun. And so if I zoom in a little bit here, you could tell the sun is coming from in front of the subject and slightly above. So this was actually a pretty harsh lighting day and it was really cold, contrary to what you might expect from the Grand Canyon. But this actually ended up being one of my more favorite portraits because it's just a really good candid shot. So the thing about lighting front lit portraits is that it's much easier than the other situations. I would recommend personally to expose for the image as if you are exposing for the subject itself and not worrying about the highlights or the shadows, because that way you can kind of mess around and play with it in post and you can get a well exposed image. But I recommend starting off with a lot of front lit situations, so placing yourself between the subject and the light so that way you can get really good lighting and you can work on your exposures from there. Especially if you're just starting out using natural lighting in a lot of your images, this is the easiest way to get well lit images. So moving on to more other different lighting scenarios, next we are going to be talking about backlit scenarios. And this is basically when your subject is in between you and the lighting scenario. So this is an image right here I took of my sister. This was for an engagement photo shoot that I did for her. And as you can tell, she is in between the sun and me, creating for a backlit scenario. The sun is a little bit at like a 45-degree angles, but for the most part, the lighting situation is pretty much backlit. And backlit scenarios can be much more difficult to expose for because you can easily blow out the sun or the highlights because, well, basically the sun is basically shooting straight into your camera lens. So it's very easy to get a lot of sun. And this can create for some interesting, say, silhouettes if that's what you're going for, but it can also create for some poorly exposed photos if you are not careful. So my recommendations for shooting in backlit scenarios would be either, depending on your intent, would be either to expose for your subject or the midtones and then worrying about the highlights and the shadows in post. So that's basically what I did for this photograph because I wanted to create that soft light and not worry too much about exposing for the highlights, which would underexpose my subject. Another thing you could do when you're shooting in backlit scenarios would be to lower the exposure overall. So you are, to lower the exposure overall. So what I'm doing in this scenario is I'm exposing for in between my midtones and my highlights, and this lowers the exposure of my midtones, creating for a more silhouette-like shot. And this is really useful if you're trying to create some kind of mood or drama towards your images. I think that could be a very useful thing as well. But for backlit scenarios, it depends, right? It depends what you're going for. So if you are taking a portrait of someone, personally, I would expose for the midtones, worry about the highlights and shadows in post. if you are trying to create more of a silhouette-like shot, obviously lower your exposure and then kind of expose a little more for the highlights. And that's how you end up with a better shot, in my opinion. All right, so the next lighting scenario we are going to be talking about is kind of a side lit scenario where basically the sun is about 90 degrees from your subject, creating for a more dramatic effect and kind of a half lit effect. And this can be really interesting to implement into your photos as well, because it creates for a more dramatic scene, a higher contrast scene, and it's really interesting. So this is a photo I took of my friend at the Grand Canyon, and this is more of a side lit scenario because you can see the sun is kind of exposing one side of his face while the other is covered in shadows. And this is one of my more favorite photos as well. To be honest, I should have told him to zip up that pocket, but that's all right. But essentially, you could tell it creates for a more dramatic look because half of his face is exposed and the other half is more shadow, so it's more dramatic and it looks interesting. What I would recommend for exposing for side lit scenarios would be to underexpose slightly. And the reason why I do this is because I don't want the highlights, especially in this photo, to be too bright because then it'll blow his face out. But it's easier to create a more dramatic mood if you underexpose, because then your shadows are going to be a little bit deeper. They're going to carry a little more contrast with them, and then you can kind of, it fits with the mood of the image of a side lit image. Does that make sense? So that's just what I kind of did in this scenario. The last lighting scenario I want to show for you guys for using natural light is a mixture of the other ones, because mostly the lighting scenarios we are going to be in aren't going to be just front lit, back lit, or side lit. It's going to be a mixture of the other ones. So this photo is another image I took of my friend in the Grand Canyon area, and it was very snowy, very cold, but as you can tell, the sun is very bright, and the sun is coming from kind of an angle. It's not directly a 90-degree side lit, it's not directly a backlit, it's kind of an in-between, almost like a 45 degrees. And these are most of the scenarios you are going to be finding yourself in. What I would recommend, and the reason why I brought up the other lighting scenarios, is because they are a good way to kind of practice and a good way to be intentional about your exposure. And once you've gotten the hang of that, you can start applying them into more slightly different lighting scenarios. So most of the photos you are going to be taking are going to be a combination of the other exposure scenarios. But understanding the basics of those lighting scenarios are going to be easier for you to understand these exposure scenarios. So this one, like I said, is a bit more of a 45-degree lighting scenario. And what I like about this is it creates a more natural look. So sometimes backlit can be a little bit more dramatic, and sometimes frontlit can be a little bit too much. I want a little bit of dramatic atmosphere or a little bit of mood created by the shadows, but not too much. So I find that lighting scenarios or placing your subject in areas that it's like more of a 45 or maybe even a 30 degree of light facing your subject or backlighting your subject creates for a more natural mood and a more subtle mood, so it's not overbearing in either of the absolutes. Does that sort of make sense? All right, moving on. So the next bit of natural light I want to talk about is implementing natural light for more street photography-like scenarios. That one was a bit more for portrait and environmental type shots, but street photography is really interesting in using natural light for your composition as well. And so I don't do this too much, but a really solid technique for using natural light is when you are in between cityscapes. And the really good part about street photography and natural light is that tall buildings, because generally you will be in a city type scenario or setting when you are taking street photos, is that tall buildings create for a lot of interesting pockets of light. And so paying attention to these pockets of light can actually bring you some really interesting images and compositions. A lot of street photographers do this where they allow a subject to walk into a part of the frame which is well lit and the rest is kind of shadow. So just that person is illuminated, and that creates for a really interesting photo as well. Now, I don't do this too much because that requires you to find a spot and then just kind of wait and fish there. And to be honest, I like to walk around more and I like to go places and to move on to the next location sort of thing. So I don't fish too much, but I know this is a really good technique for implementing natural light into your photos. So we'll go ahead with another example here. So this shot right here is a photo from Barcelona. So spoiler alert, this is kind of the first photo I'm going to be showing you guys from my trip to Europe. The rest I'm still kind of working on, but this one is more for example's sake. So that's something you guys can look forward to as well. But essentially this is a skater in Barcelona. There's this really cool skate park around the area. And there was a pocket of light kind of in between the buildings that I saw that he was kind of jumping off of when he was doing his tricks. And the rest were shadows. So I thought it would be a really good opportunity to capture him in that kind of lighting scenario. My only qualm about this image is the bike in the background, which kind of cuts into his framing. But for demonstration purposes, this is all right. So essentially this is what I'm talking about. You're finding a pocket of light and you're waiting for someone to pass through it. And that is an interesting way you can kind of frame up a shot and create a more interesting photo. So that is something that I would recommend to try as well. All right, moving on. The next part of natural light I want to talk about is to actually implement natural light into your compositions. So light is a really interesting way to illuminate your subjects and create good lighting for your subjects, but it can also divide your frame into certain layers and compositions that make for interesting shots as well. So now we are delving a little bit more into non-basic ways of using lighting into your photos. So I'll show you guys what I kind of mean. And the best way of practicing this, in my opinion, is to shoot in black and white, because then you are basically just seeing white layers. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and talk about this photo. This was a photo I took when I was out on one of my street sessions. And as you can tell, it's a very clear and obvious way of using natural light to split up the frame and composition. Right here, I have two kind of crates, but then I have one crate illuminated by light and the other one covered in shadow. And there's also a nice shadow covering this building in the background as well, which splits up the frame into compositions. So it's a lot of lines, a lot of light and shadow, and there we can get a really cool and interesting composition. So this is just another example I would recommend to try out. Look for little pockets of light, like I said, but also find ways that they illuminate buildings to kind of divvy up your frame. And I think that's another way of using natural light to create a more interesting shot. Moving on to the next example, this is kind of another street shot I took at the beach one sunset. And as you can tell, this is a strong contrast, a heavy contrast type of image where basically all the rocks are covered in shadows, but the beach itself is illuminated a bit. And I think this creates for more of a dynamic image because of the contrast that it presents. So this is another case of being able to use light to your advantage, or natural light to your advantage, is to choose which subjects you are lighting up as opposed to which subjects you are not lighting up. So I chose to leave a lot of these rocks kind of blend in with the shadows to keep them dark and lower exposure for those parts. And then the rest of it is well lit. So that also kind of divides the frame up. So if you can tell, going along the sides of the rock, you can almost draw an outline of the rocks. And I think that is really interesting and just another fun way to use light to your advantage. The next example I want to share with you guys here is another street shot I took when I was, I don't know, taking pictures back in February or so. And this one is really interesting because it's an environmental portrait. So not only are we getting our subject, who is the mechanic, in kind of his own workspace, we have all of that just well set up. So there's a good amount of context in this image, but also he is taking a sip of his beer basically. And I chose to expose this and get only the beer in the lighting while he and everything else is kind of in the shadow, and that creates for a more contrasty image as well. But it also draws the focus of our image basically to the beer can. And I think this is an interesting way of lighting the situation as well. So just being selective on the subject and what you choose to illuminate can change the photo entirely. So as you can see, that is another interesting way we can use natural light in our photos. We can use them and implement them compositionally rather than just for lighting scenarios. So that is the next step in what I would recommend, to try and find interesting ways to implement natural light to either illuminate or not illuminate your subject, but to also create frame lines in between your images to create something that looks more storytelling sort of thing, you know? All right, moving on. So the next thing we are going to be talking about in terms of natural light is using them for reflections. I think reflections are really, really interesting, and the different way we position ourselves in the situation that we are taking a photo can create a more interesting reflection. So I'll go ahead and show you guys what I mean. This is the first image right here. This is one of the photos I took when I was walking around kind of a park, and I thought this was an interesting way to illuminate and take advantage of the natural light. So as you can tell, the sun is coming from this corner kind of right here. So it's almost like a backlit scenario, but the main subject I guess our attention would be drawn to is this plank in the middle of the lake. And if you zoom in, you can tell the plank is not this actual whole thing, but rather the plank is half of it and the reflection is the other half of what seems to be the plank itself. And I thought that was interesting. I thought that was cool. And so that is another example of a way you can use reflections based on the natural light to kind of change the composition of your image, change the subject of your image even. Because now our subject, it's a little confusing to tell what the subject is until you zoom in on it. And that's kind of what I wanted to play with when I was introducing this photo to the viewer or the reader or whoever is looking at this. So that's just another example. Next up I want to talk about is this photo right here. And this isn't so much of a reflection, but rather it's the use of shadows when you are using lighting scenarios, because light can implement a lot of different things into your image, and one of those things is these shadows. So as you can see right here, these shadows are very elongated. It's another backlit scenario, but our subjects are these two bikers right here. But the shadows, they almost seem to kind of reach out towards us because they're so long and they extend to the corners of the frame where we are viewing. So it's an easier way of guiding the viewer to look at our subject, which is the bikers, but also a use of the lighting scenario to our advantage to create a more interesting image. So that's another example I wanted to show you guys as well. Alright, so those are kind of my general tips on how to use natural light in photography or implement them into your own photography. We talked about several things today. Just to kind of wrap it up, we talked about how to use basic lighting techniques and how we should expose in those certain situations like front lit, backlit, or side lit scenarios. We talked about how to use light kind of compositionally to interestingly break up frames of our images. And now there is one more thing I want to mention to you guys, and that is how to actually practice using light in your images rather than just, doing it, so to speak. So this one is a bit more of a training tool. If you want to get better at using light in your photos, I would recommend to change your camera settings to black and white only. So you can shoot raw, and with Fujifilm cameras, you can kind of get the color back when you put them into the editing system. But if you're shooting with a different kind of camera system, it might vary. But for the most part, most camera systems allow you to change your settings to a certain black and white profile. And then I would just leave it on that setting and go outside and take pictures. And this is the best way to practice using light in your images, because black and white photos force you pretty much to focus on highlights and shadows. You don't really get room to think about color because, well, there is no color. So with that in mind, even taking a picture of, for example, like this one, which is like a mailbox, even just taking a picture of this has an interesting use of light, or at least a different use of light. It forces you to try more things, it forces you to get outside of your comfort zone, and it forces you to compose your subject in ways that aren't in use of color. Doesn't that make sense? Because I think color compensates and makes up for a lot of these things, or a lot of these subtractions of light that we don't realize. So that is the best way to practice using light in your photos, would be to change your camera to a black and white setting and just go out and take photos and see what you can create. So hopefully these tips kind of helped you guys along the way. I was kind of trying to gather my thoughts as I was making these things, so it wasn't the most cohesive thing, but you get the point at least, hopefully. If this helped you out, then that's great. If it doesn't, then you don't have to do any of these tips. These are just things that I personally like to implement into my own photography. If you have any other tips on using natural light in your own photography, please leave them down below. I think it will help a lot of people who are looking to get better in their own craft. If you like this video, please like the video down below, subscribe to this channel for more photography things, and as always, have a great day. I will see you guys in another video. Peace.